started the Free America 10 years ago in response to a press in America that was not doing its job. It was not reporting on what happened. It was not reporting to the American people what was really going on. Hi, I'm Clay Douglas. We're filming today at the Gran Cuevera Ruins, middle of New Mexico. Once a great trading center between the Pueblo Indians and the Plains Indians. This is where everybody gathered. This is where they traded. This is where up to 1,500 people once lived. And there are places on earth, even more ancient than this, where people once congregated and lived. What happened to those civilizations? Maybe the same thing that's happening to ours. Fortunately, a lot of America is waking up today because of videos like this and because of magazines like the Free American. People are starting to become aware that the divisions between this conservative and liberal, right and left, are propaganda ploys to keep us apart, to keep us from realizing that our country has been basically taken over. By who? We'll try to find that out for you. We're attempting to lay the foundation of an understanding on which you can build your knowledge. But first, we've got to get down to the bedrock.
I'd like to see a show of hands. How many of you can tell me in one sentence exactly what your constitutional rights are? Can anybody tell me? Anybody want to guess? No, I don't see a single hand. I can give it to you in one sentence, ladies and gentlemen. You don't have any. If you don't know how to use the court system and you can't afford a lawyer, you have no rights. It is that simple. That's been true since time immemorial.
My name's Alfred Adisk. I publish a magazine called Suspicions, used to be the Anti-Shyster. We have meetings here in Dallas for Citizens for Legal Reform. For what it's worth, I ran for the Supreme Court of Texas back in 1992. I received 201,000 votes, which was a small number compared to the winner got several million. But regardless, seeing that I'm not a lawyer or a judge, it was a reasonable achievement just to get on the ballot. It was supposed to be illegal, and we managed to do that. Over the years, we've done what we can to goose this government as best we can. And I've become a student of the legal system, and one thing's led to another. And one of the things I've come to understand just recently is the difference between a republic and a democracy. And what I'm going to try to show you today, I'm going to try to illustrate the foundation for that difference, and I'm going to show you why a democracy is the last place you want to be. I'm going to show you why a democracy is a collectivist form of government. And under that form of government, you have no unalienable rights. You have no meaningful individual rights. You are caught in a position that is virtually identical to that of a serf and subject under the former feudal law systems that existed prior to the Declaration of Independence.
Our government has become a monster, and it's out here amongst us. And I said, we've got to put that monster in a cage. We are in this position in this country today. This monster is above us. This monster has control of us. Fear is the greatest control factor that has ever been created and put on mankind. And that's what this monster uses to keep we the people in line. And so here's the position that we find ourselves in.
Starting in 1776 with that Declaration of Independence, we were a nation of kings. Each man was a king. And it says here, where do we get our rights? We're endowed by our Creator. Those rights, those unalienable rights, flow from God. They do not flow from government. They don't flow. They're not human rights. They're not civil rights. These are the unalienable rights that flow from God, and we get them directly. I get my unalienable rights from God as an act of my creation. You get your unalienable rights from God as an act of your creation. You get yours from God as an act of creation, of your creation. These rights do not depend on any other individual. They don't depend on government. We hold them intrinsically in the same sense that we hold our own DNA. They are unique to each of us, and they can't be taken away lawfully.
I had some money coming back on my 1963 taxes, and the IRS didn't want to give me the money. They sent one of the hierarchy from down in Utah, from the regional headquarters up to Billings, Montana, and he had the authority to settle this case. And I said, fine, write me a check. And no, he was not going to do that, but that if I would slip him a few bucks on the side, why then he could settle it. It was an outright violation of law, and I knew it, but I knew I was realistic. I knew there was nothing I could do about it, but I became very angry, and at that time I was a redhead, and I was known as Red Beckman across this country. Have been known as Red Beckman. That's been my handle for a long time. Anyway, I got my money back because I became very angry. And I read this hierarchy from the IRS in Ogden, Utah. I read him the Riot Act, and I got a check. But I knew that we had a serious problem. And since that time, I have talked to business people the length and breadth of this land. Business people who have been extorted, had money extorted from them by IRS personnel. Now, I said back there that I was trying to make this system work the way they taught me in that government school. I tried to make it work, and it didn't work. It couldn't work because the government wouldn't let it work.
Third sentence, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. What is the purpose of legitimate government? To secure these rights. What rights? The rights in the previous sentence, the unalienable rights. And who gave us those rights? God. The purpose of government is not to secure our civil rights. It's not to secure our human rights. According to our Declaration of Independence, the purpose of government is to secure the God-given unalienable rights. That is the sole purpose of government. Today, you would be hard-pressed to find a congressman, a senator, or any other form of politician who has passed a law that was intended to secure your unalienable rights. For the most part, all they do are pass laws that are special interest legislation. Special interest legislation is essentially a license to steal. The way it works is if I had enough money, I can take a bushel basket of money, walk into a congressman's office, dump the bushel basket of money on his desk and say, Congressman, I would like a special act passed that will mandate that every one of you people have to buy subscriptions to Suspicions magazine. If I give the congressman enough money, he says, you know, I think that's a heck of an idea. I think they should all read Suspicions magazines. Let's pass a law to do it. What it is a license to steal. He is licensing through special interest legislation. He licenses every union and company and industry that walks in the door. One way or another, somebody's making a buck off that legislation. And that's virtually all they pass. And every bit of it is a license to hustle the people out there in TV land.
I had to study. I had to do my homework. I had to go back and pick up the history books. I had to go back and research what the founders tried to give us back there over 200 years ago with a government system that was called a constitutional republic. I learned something back there in the early 70s that was a total shock to me, and that was that our form of government, our lawful form of government, was a constitutional republic. But when I went to high school, they said, we've got a democracy. We've got majority rule. Somebody had changed our governmental system, and I had to know why.
The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a Republican form of government. Do we have it? I can tell you one of the things that's interesting about it is we send soldiers overseas to fight for democracy. I was just listening to Colin Powell on the television today on Face the Nation or whatever it was. I'm not sure where he was being interviewed. They talked about Venezuela, and they pointed out that it's a democracy and we're in favor of democracy in the Western Hemisphere. The Constitution does not mandate a democracy. The word democracy does not appear in our Constitution. It appears in none of our foundation documents. Instead, we are mandated to have a Republican form of government. Nobody's talking about that. And there's no wiggle room on it. We're mandated. And it's not just in the federal Constitution. Take a look at Article 1, it's the Bill of Rights of the Texas State Constitution. Section 2, inherent political power, Republican form of government. All political power is inherent in the people, and all free governments are founded on their authority. The faith of the people of Texas stands pledged to the preservation of a Republican form of government. And subject to this limitation only, the people of Texas, they have at all times the inalienable right to alter, reform, or abolish their government in such manner as they think expedient. There's no wiggle room. You can do anything you want in the government of Texas, but it must be a Republican form of government.
One of the things we found out was that the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and the 17th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, those two amendments to our Constitution were attached to our Constitution by way of fraud, and that those two amendments changed our lawful form of government from a constitutional republic to a democracy, a majority-rule democracy. What is the difference between the two?
I can remember a long time ago in a junior high school far, far away, they taught me that you can't define a word using the word in the definition. A Republican government is one in the Republican form. Well, golly. I mean, there's some news for you. I mean, that's going to be that's a test question. What is a Republican form of government? It's one in the Republican form. That is not a good definition. And when you begin to see that virtually all of the dictionaries come up with definitions like this, you begin to understand that someone is trying to conceal the meaning of a Republican form of government. And they've been doing it for over 100 years.
A majority-rule democracy, the individual doesn't count. He has no power. He has no clout unless he's part of a great special interest of some kind. He has no power. In a constitutional republic, the individual is the one with the power. Now, I think that is the preferable form of government. And the founders of this country understood that principle because James Madison said, he said, you don't want a democracy. He is considered as the founder, or rather the author, the father of our Constitution. He understood the power that the individual must retain if you're going to have an orderly society. He said, if you get a democracy, you will have the loss of property rights and you will have chaos.
To learn the difference between a republic and a democracy, we can take a look at Government Training Manual number 2025, published in 1928 for Army officers. And it talks about a republic, and it says authority is derived through election of the people of public office, best fitted to represent them. Attitude toward property is respect for laws and individual rights and a sensible economic procedure. It goes on. I won't read the whole thing. You can see it on the screen behind me. But essentially, in 1928, in a manual published by the United States military for the benefit of our officers, they're saying republic is a good deal. Okay, this is what we're ready to fight and die for, as a republic back in 1928. Today we fight for democracy. Strange thing. Here's how they define democracy in that training manual in 1928. Democracy, a government of the masses. Authority derived through mass meetings and any other form of direct expression results in mobocracy. Attitude toward property is communistic. Negating property rights. Attitude toward laws that the will of the majority shall regulate, whether it be based upon deliberation or governed by passion, prejudice, and impulse, without restraint or regard to consequences. Results in demagogism, license, agitation, discontent, anarchy. Clearly, our nation's military did not think much of democracy. They are warning their officers this is a bad deal. That's 1928. It's really not that long ago. Okay?
The founders of this country, they wanted us up here, and they wanted a system where there were bars on that cage that would keep that monster in.
Black's Seventh gave me the clue on which this entire presentation is based. Black's Seventh Law Dictionary, published in 1999. They defined republic, not Republican form of government, but they have this definition of republic, and it says, and this opened my eyes. I'd seen it a number of times. I didn't pick up on the significance. You've got to read between the lines to grasp the significance here. It says a system of government in which the people hold sovereign power and elect representatives who exercise that power. Okay, people hold sovereign power.
And they said, we'll have elections. Well, we aren't able to control that monster with our vote on election day, are we? They said, we're going to put some more bars on the cage. They said, we're going to put what is known as a grand jury into the system. You go to the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, the fifth article of our Bill of Rights. And the very first clause, it says, they cannot prosecute us for an infamous crime without the indictment of a grand jury. What's an indictment of a grand jury? It's the consent. It's the consent of the governed. They have to come to we the people. This isn't government people. This is people like you and I that get called for grand jury duty. And they cannot prosecute somebody for an infamous crime. That's the law now. They can't prosecute anybody for an infamous crime unless they have our consent.
In the republic, you hold sovereign power as an individual who possesses unalienable rights that flow directly from God. You hold sovereign power. Each of us holds sovereign power as individuals. But in the democracy, we hold the sovereign power as a collective. The organized whole is the collective. It's for this reason that democracy is fundamentally identical to communism and socialism. It is completely contrary to the fundamental principles that were espoused by the Declaration of Independence. It said all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator. The democracy says, no, sir. They may be equal, but they are not endowed with unalienable rights that they hold as individuals. They do not hold that sovereign power as individuals.
And then they put another bar on the cage. The trial jury. Now, I think that critter, we've got him in a cage. Who is it? Who is it that gets called for grand jury duty? Who is it that gets called for trial jury? And what's the difference in these people that are being called? You see, we've got some people that are called for grand jury duty, and I'm saying the majority of them, most of them, have never learned one single thing about a grand jury. When they get called for grand jury duty, they go in there and they're blank. And they are manipulated by what? This monster. The U.S. Attorney's Office, the district attorney, he's in here. This monster here has represented the Congress of the United States, the Supreme Court, and the President, and all the rest of them. They're here. And so we, the people, get called for grand jury duty, and if we don't know what a grand jury is supposed to be doing, we're going to be U-S-E-D. We're going to be used.
Well, my name is Larry Dodge. I am the founder of the Fully Informed Jury Association. This is a group that started out with an educational mission in 1989. The mission was to tell all American people that when you are on a jury, if you think the law itself is wrong, you don't have to use it on the defendant. We have a lot of bad law in this country. In fact, one of the inspiring documents that got me going on this was a picture of the Bill of Rights with void where prohibited by law written across the front of it as like a red rubber stamp. There are a lot of laws that violate our Bill of Rights, and the ability to say no is what determines whether the people are in charge of the government and in charge of protecting their rights, or the government is in charge of the people and in charge of dispensing rights, as though the government were the repository of them.
If you were to look at it schematically, it looks something like this. In the Republican form of government, we've got God on top. He hands out unalienable rights to each individual. All right, single line. Each of us hold those rights as individuals, and we in turn grant certain limited powers. We delegate certain powers and authorities to government to act as our servant.
The Fifth Amendment says they cannot prosecute anybody without an indictment. They have to have the consent. They can't send anybody to jail without the consent of the governed. One individual on that trial jury can hang the jury. Deny the government a conviction. One person that has the truth and knows the truth can put this bar up here on this cage and corral that critter. One person. That's how much power you have in a constitutional republic. That's how it was designed. And you don't have to know a great deal about law or anything else, but if you don't like it, you don't indict somebody for violating it, do you?
You get into the democracy. The law form is that man as a collective, all of us put together hold the sovereign power. But no individual has sovereign power. We have man as the collective, government number 2 position, but down here on the bottom, the individuals, I'm not sure if you can see that, each of us are once again reduced to the status of subjects. We are now below government. We are not above government as was established in the American Revolution.
How did we get this system? How did we come by this governmental system, this political system? How did we get it? We got it because there were some people back there who understood that there's a higher power, our Creator. They understood that government that is not limited, that is not controlled, becomes an outlaw government, and the people suffer. The people are plundered. People are plundered by law when you have a tyranny.
For the democracy to work, you can't, no person can have an unalienable right to life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness. Because anytime you have that, people say, listen, we have voted to take your house. And you say, whoa, 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 I got a God-given right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that includes owning my property. The democracy collapses. You can't do it in the republic because the unalienable rights which you receive from God, as per the Declaration of Independence, are superior to anything 300 million people voting against you cannot lawfully overcome any right which is essentially a blessing given you by God. God gives me that right. I don't care how you vote. You have no authority to take my home. You have no authority to take my car. You have no authority to take my children. Not in a republic, not where I have unalienable rights. But in the democracy, yeah. You can vote to take my house, my kids, my property. And likewise, I can get a coalition together and we can vote to take yours. You have no defense against the will of the collective. And if they don't like the color of your eyes, the color of your skin, the way you talk, your age, your status, and your economic status, they can vote against you anytime, and you have no unalienable right to resist. If you did, the democracy could not exist. If we could sit back within a democracy and say, oh, I still have those unalienable rights, democracy fails. Doesn't work.
Who has the authority in the system? Our founders, they said God is at the top. God's law is superior. It is supreme. It is at the very top. And they understood the laws of common sense. They understood the laws of grammar.
Who's missing? God. The democracy can't function if we have unalienable rights. What's the source of unalienable rights? As declared in the Declaration of Independence, the source of those rights, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. When the democracy says you have no unalienable rights, it implicitly says there is no God. As is true of every collectivist system, including what we saw in the Soviet Union, communism, socialism. They necessarily must deny God, because if they don't, they have to admit His authority to give people unalienable rights, which the government may not overcome.
They got this idea implanted in our brains back there when I was a kid, that we have constitutional rights. Who has constitutional rights? How can we as individuals have any rights coming from this down here, from the Constitution? Because it's under us. We're not under the Constitution. We're above it. When we went into the military, if we go to work for the government, we have to take an oath. And we have to take an oath and says that we swear to defend this Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic. Well, we're up here. They should have said something about enforcing this law, but they didn't, because they didn't want us to understand that principle, that it is we the people who are the responsible party to see to it that this Constitution is enforced.
Who's missing from the democracy? God. In the democracy is where you'll see your government pushed for the separation of church and state. The democracy cannot withstand, as with all collectivist systems, it can't withstand any competition from God.
The Creator always is to remain in control of its creation. We were given by the founders of this country back there a 3-vote political system. A 3-vote political system. The only place you've ever heard that or read of it is probably in one of my books, because I put it right in the first book I wrote over 20 years ago. The 3 votes of our system. And here is the beauty of it. We elect congressmen and senators. We let them create this legislation. We let the President of the United States sign it into law. We let the judiciary make a finding on it. But you will find at no place in that Constitution where we, the people, gave a grant of power to anybody down here to enforce the law that they created. They have no authority to enforce the law they created.
What do we do about it? Well, one of the things, again, go back to the Declaration of Independence. You can find a little advice that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, and by these ends, it means what's the purpose of government? Third sentence in the Declaration of Independence, to secure these rights, to secure our unalienable rights granted by God. That is the only legitimate purpose for government according to our Declaration of Independence. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, in other words, securing those unalienable rights, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and then organizing its powers and so on as they see fit. They give you a clue, and they're telling you if you really are fed up with the democracy, it's up to you to do something about it.
Thomas Jefferson said, "I consider trial by jury as the only anchor yet devised by man by which a government can be held to the principles of its constitution." What did he mean? He meant that 12 ordinary people can take a look at the situation when they're on a jury and judge not only the facts of the case but the law itself. Obviously, whoever is in charge of the laws of the land and how they're applied is in charge of the government.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and
armed, disciplined, organized and trained military and police forces. And by comparing the demand for these military and police forces with the supply, I'm going to point out that it will take more armed, disciplined, organized and trained people to do the job than we presently have. The impact of 500,000 or 900,000 deaths in a metropolitan area, and even more people seriously ill who have to be treated before they die or as survivors, would have a catastrophic impact on the city. It would require stern measures. To give some of the ill people a chance to survive. Read the newspapers, you'll see about violence that permeates our society. Now, violence is now the norm over small things. Just ponder on how bad it will be during a catastrophic emergency. Armed, disciplined, organized and trained personnel are needed to maintain law and order, manage the orderly movement of large numbers of people, secure facilities and installations, and provide or manage the provision of essential supplies and services. These duties must be done by police officers and military personnel who are entitled to bear arms as members of legal law enforcement agencies, the armed forces of the United States, and the duly constituted militia, the state guard. This may shock you to your very souls. I'm just going to read the little fact sheet I prepared for the Office Secretary of Defense, and they are believers now. The Posse Comitatus Act does not prohibit the use of the military services to enforce the laws of the United States. Unfortunately, there is a general belief that the Posse Comitatus Act does prohibit the use of the military service to enforce the laws of the United States. You guys have heard people say that. Everybody says it. They're wrong. They all got it backwards. What the Posse Comitatus Act does, it makes only the President or the Congress able to order the armed forces to enforce the laws of the United States. It does not interfere with the presidential authority. It says nothing about that. Therefore, there is no general opposition legally to the use of the armed forces to enforce the laws of the United States, and presidents have done so repeatedly, as the example of federalizing the Guard to enforce the laws of the United States at the University of Alabama. Now, catastrophic emergencies will cause mass movements of people. They will seek to escape the danger and find refuge elsewhere. Either way, managing the movement out of the danger areas and into secure areas will take large numbers of trained personnel to control traffic, arrange for essential support en route, and see to the resettling in the destination areas. Many of these evacuation managers have to be police or military personnel to assure positive control of the bulk of the people who will obey orders and handle also the minority of people who will not obey orders and who will resist authority and disrupt the movement. A major smallpox epidemic could require large numbers of troops to maintain a quarantine line that desperate or unruly people would attempt to penetrate, to leave the infected area and find safety outside. I estimate it would take 400,000 troops to maintain a quarantine perimeter of 310 miles for a prolonged period of time. A major urban riot, such as could occur during a prolonged power outage, could also require several 100,000 troops to maintain order and oversee the distribution of food and other essential supplies. Now, my estimates could be wrong. They are good estimates. I think they're all for it, but if you take my estimates, then you need at least 1 million. Armed, disciplined, organized, and trained personnel, in addition to the police officers, to handle these catastrophic emergencies. Now, I'm only half right, which is quite possible, and those numbers are still very large.
When Johnny comes marching home.
We've been telling you this for years, ladies and gentlemen, in the Free American and on our radio show. Here you've got it straight from the horse's mouth, straight from the Department of Homeland Security, straight from FEMA, that they need 500 million to 1 million troops to contain the American people. Ladies and gentlemen, we've only sent 250,000 to conquer Iraq. 1 million troops in our streets. Posse Comitatus suspended. No other media will give you the truth. We do at the Free American. We're going to have more information and more expert witnesses on our next video, part 2 in our series.
So Thomas Jefferson knew something about juries that we don't know today, which is that they are the boss. They are ordinary people. They've been entrusted with the power of the country, and they can decide which laws are going to be applied to whom and why. And as long as that's the case, the people are in charge of the government, and the government is confined to its role as the servant of the people. In today's world, that's been reversed. That's why there is now a fully informed jury association, because juries are no longer told you are judges of the law as well as of the fact. Somebody's got to tell them. They're actually lied to in the courts of the land. The judge will tell a jury, I will give you the law and you've got to use it as I give it to you, whether you agree with it or not. In other words, the jury has been made into a computer, a fact machine. Pour in the facts on one side, pour out the verdict on the other, according to the law as somebody else gives it to you. They've had their power taken away. So the Fully Informed Jury Association's job is to tell them the truth, judge the law as well as the fact.
The proper term is the 6th article of the Bill of Rights. Says that in all criminal cases, you have the right to trial by jury. In other words, a jury is the one, they are the ones who are to determine whether you have violated this law down here or not. We didn't give the judge that authority. We didn't give the U.S. attorney over here in this branch of government the authority to say we're guilty. Our peers over here, they're the ones who have the authority to enforce the law or not to enforce it.
We've had a lot of cases recently where jurors have come out and actually wept, cried, and hugged the defendant and said, "We're sorry, but we had to convict you. That's because the judge told us we had to follow the law, like it or not, and technically you broke it. And so we convicted you, even though in our hearts we know that you were in the right." Well, that's a sad state of affairs. That's just exactly what Jefferson did not want to see happen in these United States.
And we have all of this case law, tremendous case law, over many, many years, going way back to the very beginning of this country. We have so many cases where the people on the juries have said, no, we will not enforce this law because it is bad law.
So what we're doing is we're passing out pamphlets as the Fully Informed Jury Association, telling jurors just what I've told you. We go right down to the courthouse and hand them out in front of the courthouse. We know that among the crowds of people coming into a courthouse, usually on a Monday morning, a great number of them are going to be selected for jury duty. They're going to be lied to by the judge. They're going to be told, follow the law, like it or not. And sometimes the law is not going to make sense. In those kinds of cases, we want the jurors to reach inside and say, not guilty. Not guilty because the law itself is defective or it's being used wrongly today, and I can't in my good conscience convict this person. So what we're asking for is commonly known as jury nullification, jury veto power. It's also called the jury mercy doctrine.
Well, these people on the jury are up here and this guy is down here. He's a public servant. How come we as the masters are listening to this guy down here? We're supposed to be doing our own thinking up here. We're the masters and he's the servant. Since when do we take orders from our servants? When a judge tells a jury to find somebody guilty, they should just automatically say, hey, this guy is an outlaw. He doesn't have that authority. We're the ones that say whether the guy is guilty, and so just to teach that guy a lesson, our servant down there a lesson, we're all going to say not guilty. Over the years, I've spoke to hundreds of audiences across this country. The 3 greatest words of the English language is, I love you. I love you. 3 greatest words there are. The 3 saddest words are, I didn't know. And I tell this story. I went and sat in on those trials over there in Helena, Montana back in 1976 because I said, I'm going to find out where the IRS got its power. They prosecuted 5 young, very productive people in 5 days. They gave each one of them 1 day for a trial. And they railroaded them off to the Huskow. And the one trial, I went and followed the jury out. And the foreman of that jury, I was able to talk to him. And I talked to him for 45 minutes or an hour, quite a while. And I explained to him what he had done. And the man had tears in his eyes. And I heard those 3 sad words, I didn't know. How many people are there out there that are going to watch this tape that are going to say, oh, I was on a jury that found somebody guilty of violating a very bad law. I was on a jury, that judge told me that I had to find him guilty, and I did what he told me to do. Why? They did it because they didn't know they were up here. They thought they were down here someplace. They thought that that judge had the authority to do all of this. And when those people, when they say guilty in that tax case, they've just taken all the bars off the cage. And that monster is out there is going to grab the guy and put him in a cage in some federal prison. Why? I didn't know. The grand jury was to be a check against the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government. The jury, the trial jury, the petit jury was to be a check against the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government. How can they be a check against those branches of government if they allow a judge to control their vote? Are you going to go to the polls on election day, and what are you going to do if that judge walks in there and gets into that booth with you and says, vote here and vote there and vote here? You'd kick him out. Why are we letting them tell us how to vote on the grand jury and the trial jury? We don't let them tell us how to vote on election day, do we? I got to wind this down. I'm a concerned American, and you had better be concerned too, and especially if you are the parents of children and the grandparents of children. You have a responsibility. My wife and I are going to celebrate our 50th wedding anniversary here very shortly in a matter of a few days. We have 11 grandchildren. I have a responsibility to try to secure some kind of a future for them. And I'm very concerned about what is going on, what is being passed on to them. And I hope that this videotape will give you a clue how you can be a strong individual, how you can be a check against this bunch of outlaws that we've got in our government. And they are outlaws because they're violating the law that we the people wrote. Now, I have written these several books, and they're out there available. We did a massive work in Montana. We found that the 16th Amendment to the Constitution was a fraud. It had never been ratified. The law that never was. The income tax is a total fraud because it is built upon a fraud. The 17th Amendment, it is a fraud. We have all of these thousands upon thousands of documents. There's over 17,000 certified documents from all of the states of the Union that we have. And how was it done? How did it happen? It happened because there were some people at this level that said, we're going to learn the truth. We're going to find the truth. And they did the research. The research that backs up this book here cost the people of this country about $100,000 to see that it was done, that we had to send an investigator to all of the states and collect all of this documentation. You too can be effective if you know. But if you just have a belief system that they implanted in the government school or in a government church or what have you, you're in trouble, and our country is in trouble. So let's get our belief system straightened out, and we can be real effective, and we can live to see a better day in this country.
Excellent job. I'm totally impressed. I'm totally amazed. You know your topic, and you're bringing out the message. You should know your enemy. You should know who the scammer is so you're not the scammy. And the other thing you've been hitting on those lines is, let's go to basics. Let's go back to basics. I have 2 books. Most of you people in here think you know what communism is. You know what communism looks like. And I'm standing here to tell you, you don't. Any prior knowledge you have of the 20th century in the United States of America and its history on communism and a conspiracy, put it outside the door, please, because it's all wrong. I forgot to do this too. I'm sorry, your patience. The Republic's in peril.
Part of the problem is understanding what the problem is. Often we're given by the press false information in order to lead to a certain conclusion. Many of these conclusions that we come to are erroneous. So we have to go back, we have to take a couple of steps back, we have to look at what the real problem is and the issues we're dealing with today. In reality, there are only two types of government: educated, empowered, self-governing individuals, and on the other hand, every other form of tyranny.
The doctrine of Marx and Engels founded on the basis of a materialist conception of history. Communism is the stage following after socialism and when social classes cease to exist. Communism does not yet exist in any country. This was written in 1964. I will go out on a philosophical limb. If communism has never existed, then somebody in my good name tell me what Ronald Reagan defeated in 1986. And this is why everybody's missed a point. This is another good book. I'm talking to you about a thing called the permanent revolution. Unfortunately, in the 20th century, the permanent revolution, the communist that has never existed, has gotten all the propaganda. And everybody's missed who's really doing it to you. It's difficult to explain the permanent revolution to you in 25 words or less. That's an impossibility. It's even a further impossibility to go to a Marxist and ask them what the permanent revolution is, and they will spend 3 hours qualifying their individual position and never once get to tell you what the permanent revolution is. And this has got some of the most devastating material you'd ever want to know if you want to be able to identify the conspiracy and who's doing it to us. According to Marx, and I'm quoting from page 8 of the introduction, according to Marx, fundamental changes in the mode of production, that's how we make things in our factories, have resulted in the evolution of society in general, and class societies in particular. Slavery was succeeded by feudalism. Western European feudalism gave birth to capitalism. Capitalism, he predicted, would in turn one day give way to socialism and would proceed to create a classless society. I slip over to page 9. Marx's pre-vision of a socialist society presupposed the development of the highly industrialized and mechanized production fostered by capitalism. In other words, Trotsky was saying, before we can even think to have socialism, to get to communism, we first must have a highly evolved, developed, and established, technologically advanced industrial society. Without that, you will never have communism, because you will not have the technology capable of keeping track of all the nuts and bolts to institute, each according to his needs and each according to his abilities. I would venture to say most of you in here have heard that phrase before, but I don't think there's a one of you can get up in this country, get up and go out of this room and point to a place where that's reality. During and after their establishment in Europe, capitalist forces and relations invaded the rest of the world in forms very different from those of their original appearances on the European continent. Capitalism won power in Western Europe through a series of revolutionary onslaughts against feudalism. Their very first revolution was the American Revolution. The oppositional bourgeoisie democratic forces there, in alliance with the artisans and peasants, that's the workers, successfully struggled for land reform, swept aside the impediments to industrialization, and consolidated their respective nations into socialism. That's happening in this country and you don't even know it. It's right in front of your very eyes and you don't even see it. I have read countless, hundreds of thousands of right-wing publications and nobody comes to the permanent revolution. If you do not include the permanent revolution into your political ideology, you follow a false doctrine. And through that action alone, you become a useful idiot of the conspiracy that you in fact fear.
Bird. They drugged this particular defendant before the same judge that in 5 years previously held such a law unconstitutional. But this time around, the federal prosecutor, in response to the defendant's argument that the feds couldn't do this, stepped forward and noted that we had a new treaty, and the treaty gave them power to enact such laws. And in fact, there are 4 crimes that are specifically mentioned in the United States Constitution, and those crimes are treason. We're not engaged in treason. They are. We're not engaged in counterfeiting, the second crime. They are. We're not engaged in piracies and the felonies on the high seas, which is the 3rd category. And the 4th category of crimes mentioned in the U.S. Constitution is offenses against the laws of nations. And it was demonstrated in that particular case that the migratory bird laws, being predicated upon a treaty, constituted an offense against the laws of nations, and therefore those criminal laws of Uncle Sam protecting migratory birds could be applied in Arkansas. And that is the reason why this judge came around and did an about-face, a 180 degrees decision that he made upholding the power of Uncle Sam. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the way that the New World Order is coming at us like a blooming freight train.
Article 1, Section 8, I'll find it here in a minute. It has to do with the duties of the legislature. Where are you? I should have marked my page mark dropped. And in short, it says Congress has the right to lay and collect excises. Congress. Today, our trade policy is set by an act of compliance to a treaty through the United Nations called the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade. It is an act of compliance through the executive branch of the United States government. It is done through a special trade negotiator appointed by the President of the United States. Congress has nothing to do with protecting this country.
This country is just, it's just unbelievable. It's just unbelievable. Have you heard about that? The General Agreement on Tariff and Trade? The so-called Free Trade Agreement? It's 22,000 pages. It weighs 365 pounds. That's a free trade agreement? One paragraph, we have free trade. 2 arch rivals running for president, Dole and Clinton, pushed everybody to sign it.
I'm pleased to announce that an understanding has been reached with Senator Dole. For the past 50 years, our country has led the world to create a more open and a more prosperous trading economy.
I will be writing a personal letter to each of my Republican colleagues in the Senate, enclosing all of this material, asking them to read it very carefully and suggesting that, in my view, we ought to be all in support of GATT when it comes up next week.
They don't know what it says. Do you understand the implications of that? It's time to wake up. And I'm here ringing the bell because nothing works.
Where do we get an agency such as the DEA? The Supreme Court held long ago that mere possession of any substance inside of a state is beyond federal power. Where do you get the power to prosecute mere possession of some controlled substance inside the federal courts, say like in places like Alabama? It's not me that's saying it. It's the federal courts. and they say the power is predicated upon treaties. Where do we get an agency like the FDA? It's doing the very same thing that the DEA is doing, enforcing federal laws which make it a crime to do such things as possess vitamin B12 and shark cartilage and ozone. That power of Uncle Sam is predicated upon treaties. Where do we get the FCC and the FAA? Those powers to control telecommunications and air traffic simply are not granted in the United States Constitution. However, the federal control over aviation and telecommunications comes from treaties. How many of you heard of over the last several weeks there's been debate in the halls or right up here on top of the hill? They want to bring about family leave. They want the employers in America to grant time off for family problems. Ladies and gentlemen, such a provision comes straight out of a treaty. Where do you think national health care would come from? Straight out of a treaty. Where do you think we got Social Security to begin with? In 1933, the United States entered into an agreement with the International Labor Organization. In 1934, the ILO asked Congress to pass the first Social Security Act. In May 1935, the United States Supreme Court came along in the Alton Railway case and held Social Security to be unconstitutional. That decision's never been reversed. But a mere 3 months after that decision, Congress came out with the second Social Security Act. To make a long story short, when the United States Supreme Court upheld that second Social Security Act in 1937, you can read the decision and you can see that Social Security, according to those opinions, applied only at first within the jurisdiction of the United States, which is Washington, D.C., the federal enclaves in the states and the territories and insular possessions. But where do we get Social Security? Social Security comes from Article 22 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and that constitutes the constitutional foundation for Social Security. Where do we get an agency like EPA? Where do we get these agencies that are going out and enforcing federal wetlands laws? Let me tell you, the Wetlands Treaty was adopted by the United States in September of 1986, and a mere 30 days later, we had the legislation, the federal wetlands laws, which implemented that treaty. Where do we get the environmental stuff? It all comes from treaties. Endangered species, it's not me, it's the courts that say the constitutional power to regulate and control endangered species is predicated upon treaties. Ladies and gentlemen, the treaty power of Congress is being utilized to expand the power of the federal government. And I look out from my viewpoint of a little office in Huntsville, Alabama, and I can see the future. And that future, if we enter into the UN, if we get the New World Order that the UN wants to bring in, I dare say that liberty and freedom in this country is going to go down the tubes. And we're going to have more international agencies, just like the federal agencies, coming along and implementing and enforcing their world law against the people of America.
I hold up here a copy of Tragedy and Hope, considered one of the major treatises on the history of the United States because an insider got to look at the secret files and write a history. And then I have a copy here of one of the handouts on the paper, out on the tables from the vendors. What do these two things have in common? They tell a good story, but they leave out the punchline. In pursuing the permanent revolution and seeking knowledge about it, sometimes you have to listen to people and distinguish what they are not saying. Now, this is a real dandy book. Just great. And we're all here trying to identify who's pulling the noose. But I don't think we'll ever be able to unless the guys or group of guys come forward and say, hey, we're the ones that's pulling the noose. You're never really going to know. But that doesn't mean you can't quit looking for them. Well, in this book, I'm an index surfer. I don't know how many, when you people pick up a book of nonfiction, what's the first thing you do?
Look in the index.
Look in the index. Why?
To see the names.
Why?
To see how they fit in.
Correct. I'm looking for specific things too. This book is over 1,300 pages long, and in the index I look for one simple thing, an organization called the Fabian Society. Not in the index. It's spelled F-A-B-I-A-N. Look in the index and see if it's in there. This book was written before that book. It's a very good book. It's a history of the Fabian Society from its beginning until the early 1960s. Now, if you read the index in this book and compare it to the index in that book, well, you're going to read all the same names, and you're going to read about all the same events. But his reason for the cause of those events and the reasons for the cause of events by this person, two totally different things. One's got to be right and one's got to be wrong. We presently live in a country with two different political systems. It is a function of one system to be sacrificed by the other. One country, two systems. For the last 25 years, both capitalist and communist countries alike have been going through a reform process. And they are both going through this reform process through the process of one country, two systems. The first political system is the domestic nationalist government. The second system is the permanent revolution. One country, two systems. Without question, the main tool used in the process for permanent revolution has been free trade. No major candidate from the Republican Party is going to tell you that. And none of the Reform Party candidates or Independent Party candidates or Third Party candidates are going to tell you what I'm telling you. And it's not because they don't know, it's they choose not to tell you. In this country, one system is to serve and protect the Constitution of these states united. The second system is out to destroy the first system through the use of permanent revolution, usually referred to in the terms of economic, political, religious, or social reform. Make no mistake, permanent revolution is real, and it's in the hands of the radical capitalist class. The radical capitalists will do anything to maintain their control and advancements of the permanent revolution. So quite naturally, the electoral process is a most vital event to the radical capitalists. Vote scam is part of the process of permanent revolution. It is the most vital portion of the permanent revolution that the capitalists remain in possession of the executive branch of the government of the United States and have major control over the major committees of the U.S. Congress. History, beyond a shadow of a doubt, will record Ronald Reagan was the greatest conservative in the world. But am I right? Is that what now history will record? Now, tell me, how can the father of American conservatism in his own good mind, invoking the name of the founding fathers that said, stay away from free trade, invoke it as a policy and get away with it? But he couldn't do it right away. We had to give you free trade piecemeal because I just can't come in and take away all the protections. Can you imagine the economic catastrophe we would have had in 1980 if he'd have lifted all tariffs in one shot? Put it in perspective. Think of all the people who were laid off in the 70s, and that was done gradually. And that was done on purpose. That was the blue-collar end of it. Those are the blue-collar victims of the permanent revolution. The white-collar, the bourgeoisie, was later to come in the 80s when they didn't need the bean counters anymore. There's no difference between blue-collar and white-collar workers. We're in the same boat. We have to go out and get a job. You know, that's just above broke. We have to go out and get a job from any one of the 6 major corporations that still run the world. The neoconservatives all basically came out of one college, City College of New York. Anybody ever run across City College of New York in their readings? Okay. City College of New York has been basically the hotbed of training future American economists to be good socialist bean counters, to help us set up the economic principles to implement communism. Okay? And in the book, there's pages, a list of names and organizations. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, for example. Daniel Bell, Philip Berger, Irving Kristol, Norman Podhoretz. Or an organization called the Heritage Foundation. You guys all remember the Heritage Foundation? You guys all watch C-SPAN? At night, especially when they have filler, when Congress isn't in session, they'll have the Cato Institute on. They'll have the Heritage Foundation on. Well, the Heritage Foundation, if you look in here, is located down with the New Right. They're not associated with the neoconservatives. That way the neoconservatives don't get the blame. Okay? How are you going to start implementing free trade? And then how are you going to develop the data systems to collect so we can make changes to implement that free trade? It's a real big problem for the international socialists. But thanks to the aid of the personal computer, telecommunications equipment, and the semiconductor, we have the tools. Okay? Now, how are they going to do this? In 1980, we had a lot of places in this country that were referred to as the Rust Belt. Every city had one. It's where the multinational used to be. High unemployment, high crime. And what comes with the high unemployment and the high crime comes a possibility of civil disobedience, so you bring in the drugs to make sure they are more civil than they are disobedient. Okay? Well, Reagan was faced with the challenge. He made a boast to everybody, I'm going to rebuild this country. I'm going to give us free market economics. I'm going to give you godmother in that apple pie. That's what everybody was hearing. Custom duties will no longer be collected on the cost of American labor. You business, any of you guys are businessmen, you're going to love this. You'd love to have this offering. This is the second system now. No custom duties will be collected on American labor, overhead, or profit on products assembled in the United States from foreign manufactured parts. Kind of interesting, huh? Port Authority leader so-and-so does not have to be paid, or nothing has to be paid until an import commodity leaves Toledo's foreign trade zone. Nothing was official yet. After the election, and that's when this chart showed up, it didn't just show up in Newsweek magazine, it showed up in every major union's publications, because the powers that be, one of the union people who know how the right wing was sliced up, because they wanted everybody to make sure that they saw it was those conservatives that's going to do you to you, working man. Organizations like the Heritage Foundation, which my local newspaper in Toledo, Ohio, ran a Sunday afternoon special in their Sunday Blade about the Heritage Foundation. And they have a little paragraph in here, the administration has proposed so-called enterprise zones of low taxation to attract business to run down urban neighborhoods. An idea first promoted in the United States by the Heritage Foundation. That's a lie. Well, there's got to be something about this. Oh, yeah. I found an article in Conservative Digest, and if you look on your chart, lower right-hand corner in the New Right, you'll see there's a publication here called Conservative Digest. And they've got this glowing article about how great them enterprise zones are going to be. And it's coming from the Heritage Foundation. Next thing you start seeing is Reagan reveals enterprise zone proposal. Reagan urges action on enterprise zones. In the states, every one of the 50 states, they were all passing a bill to coordinate with the federal program. In the state of Ohio, it was Regal Hines, sponsors industrial growth plan, urban enterprise zones. Toledo will be considered a free trade zone. The Toledo Blade editorializes weapons for jobs, just above broke now again. These are devastated areas. And it all comes from the Heritage Foundation. And again, I'll go back to Conservative Digest, and they had another article talking about Stuart Butler. Do a little bit more investigating, and you go find a book, and it's entitled Enterprise Zones, Greenlining the Inner Cities. And sure enough, right there it says Stuart Butler. But it's not Stuart Butler's idea. It's a cat by the name of Sir Geoffrey Howe. I'll get to it. Sir Geoffrey paid warm tribute to the thinking of Professor Peter Hall, an authority on urban planning and a former chairman of the Fabian Society. Wait a minute. The Fabian Society is dedicated to clearing the road for socialism. Dedicated to the permanent revolution of removing all obstacles to the globalization of capitalism. Because until capitalism goes global, you're not going to have socialism, and then the worker's not going to have communism. To make socialism possible, eventually, production has to equal consumption. We will not have socialism until production equals consumption. And to do that, they have to alter the wage scale, the number of people living, the number of people working. That when you start thinking about it, it has some real drastic endings when you run it out in the far length. And the one thing that stands in the way of making sure that production equals demand, thank you, it's very simple. He flashed a sign back here and I lost my thought. Is national sovereignty stands in the way. National sovereignty has to be destroyed. Free trade destroys national sovereignty. Free trade destroys the domestic economy. Free trade destroys the domestic social accountability. Free trade is your enemy. And today, the Republican candidates are both asking you, support that free trade. Neither one will argue on that point. That has to tell you something right there. Lights and bells have to go off. And the people that do this all come from, like I say, the permanent revolution. And the permanent revolution is the mother of all political movements. All political movements. I don't care if it goes from abortion to Zionism. The permanent revolution is the mother of that. 100%. You have to believe that. It goes by many, many, many names. It can be the Fabians, it can be the Council on Foreign Relations, it can be the Trilateral Commission. But they keep changing the name. How many people of you know in 1876 the first Communist International died on July 4th, 1876? Yeah, 1876 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. How many of you people know that? And Marx went back to England with a lot of money in his pocket.
We've got a mere 2 or 3 years before the system comes along and implements world government. And if we're going to stop world government, we're going to have to fight the treaty power of Congress. If we're going to increase freedom, we're going to have to stop the New World Order.
If you went down to the little theater group tonight in Denver to see the play, and they were putting on Hamlet, and you walked into the theater, you paid your money, and they give you a piece of paper, or a little booklet normally, and it has advertisers, it has who the cast is, it has what the play is about. And you know that when they give you that program, and as the program is tonight, it knows you've got a building that's been rented, or they have a facility, they've got a cast that's rehearsed, they have the money, they've sold tickets, they've collected money, and all the resources to accomplish putting on that play is understood when you receive that program. Now, after you've sat through the program for Act 1 and Act 2, and you've read the book, why would you call Act 3 a conspiracy? Like we had a program for building the stealth bomber and the stealth fighter. And that progressed over a long period of time. Now, if somebody said 2 years into the stealth fighter program, well, you're talking about history. During the building of that program, I knew where we were going in the stealth fighter program. I knew where we started, where we were going, what was done in the technological base. And the whole continuum was a program. Now, it annoys me sometimes when I talk about some of the things I'm going to be talking about today, and people say, well, that was an interesting lesson in history. It's a lesson in what you can expect in the future also. It's a lesson in what is going on today in the United States and in the world, and I'll get into that. You expect you're going to avoid some of the things I'm going to be talking about, and you're going to be caught up in them. But there's a guy by the name of Moses Hess. He's the guy who introduced both Marx and Engels to communism. And he had the idea of having the end game of the Communist World Program coincide with the Christian end-time scenario, the biblical end-time scenario. And they did this so that they could try to nullify Christian hostility. In other words, if the Christian community and evangelical community recognized the so-called Christian end-time scenario as the end game of communism, what they were shooting for, then they would nullify Christian hostility. But that's dialectical, and that's the way things are done in the communist world. In this country, we study Freud the fraud. In Russia, they study Pavlov. And a lot of people don't know it, but Lenin set Pavlov's laboratory up inside the Kremlin walls. And he personally gave Pavlov the credit for giving him the tools to avoid counter-revolution. You all know the experiment about the dogs. Now, that's what the media is playing. That's the game they're playing with you every day. They feed you the truth, a little bit of it, and they confound it with a lie. So what do you do about it? You ignore it, right? You don't get concerned about this way or that way. You don't have the confidence to move this way or that way. And so consequently, you do nothing about the facts, even though you may be exposed to a lot of the relevant facts. They formed in 1919 the Third International. The First International was set up back there in around 1848 when the Communist Manifesto was written, which was really not a program. The old manifesto, Communist Manifesto, was a propaganda piece to excite and generate a revolutionary struggle in Western Europe when they were trying to gobble up Western Europe. And originally, even before that time, the original plan back in Voltaire's time, they had planned to set up this world empire headquarters out of Paris. And when Napoleon got kicked out of Moscow in the War of 1812, they realized to survive in the European environment, they had to have some defense in depth, and they changed their target from setting up their first power base from which to expand from France to Russia. And by 1820, 1821, right on up to World War II, when they took Russia, you had periodic changes, things that were going on all over Europe and Russia where they were developing the revolutionary struggle. And when the 1905 revolution collapsed in Russia, many of the people involved in that fled to the United States, Europe. Lenin was in Bern, Trotsky came to New York, and when World War II was during World War II, Trotsky took over 300 people out of the Bronx and went back to Europe, to Russia, funded by the banking community. And Lenin was in Bern, and his whole entourage was moved back to Russia by the bankers in Germany. But in 1919, the communist world set up what they call the Third International. And it was a global operation. It wasn't a thing in Moscow. They brought their best and brightest together from around the world to set up the program of the Third International. And the operative body for that group was the Executive Committee of the Communist International. They call it the ECCI. In Russian, it would be the IKK. But that group ran and orchestrated things around the world, not just what's going on in Moscow, that's a separate operation, but what was going on around the world was orchestrated by the ECCI, the Executive Committee of Communist International. They are the people who are orchestrating things like Philby and Alger Hiss and the people who are working to take over the rest of the world. Now in 1919, when they set up the Third International, they brought their best and brightest from around the world and set up a big think tank to develop the program of the Third International. Many of the things you'll find in that program go back to 1821 or 1905. The strategy for wars of national liberation was developed by Lenin and perfected by Lenin. A lot of it was used in the 1905 revolution. And by the way, if you ladies want to understand women's lib, just go study what they did in the 1905 revolution in Russia. It's all spelled out there in detail for the same purposes that they're running the women's lib thing over here today. Now, these best and brightest from around the world worked until 1928, and they had perfected and developed the program of the Third International. And they had actually distributed it at the Fifth Party Congress in Moscow, but it was at the Sixth Party Congress in Moscow where the final version was adopted. Now, all of the documents of the Executive Committee of the Communist International were gathered together and published by Oxford University Press right after World War II, and the effort was funded by the Royal Institute of International Affairs. The Royal Institute of International Affairs was sort of a precursor to the CFR, and a lot of people in this country think, well, the CFR is running things, and the CFR is just one of dozens of organizations in other countries. And about 10 years ago, I had a list of about 14 or 15 of them. It's probably 25 or 30 CFR kinds of organizations in the other major countries around the world. Now, these series of documents go from 1919, they're chronological, year by year, until 1942, 1943. And they end in 1943 because the ECCI was disbanded in 1943, supposedly. There were people in the United States like Senator Taft and the conservatives in the U.S. Senate and the House who were not willing to give Russia aid and lend-lease during World War II until they agreed to disband the ECCI, because these people knew that the ECCI was orchestrating this global takeover all around the world, and they weren't willing to aid and abet that effort by funding the Russians unless they agreed to disband the ECCI. Well, they agreed to disband the ECCI, but Earl Browder, who was later head of the Communist Party in the United States, broke with the party, by the way, also. He wrote a book, and he said they never disbanded the ECCI. They never moved out of the building. They didn't even change the marquee on the building. And their operation in the ECCI was something about a Pentagon-sized operation. Christopher Story, a friend of mine who is the editor and publisher of the Soviet Analyst, he's probably one of the most astute observers and intelligence guys I know of in the world who deal with the things I'll be talking about today. He had never seen these, never been exposed to these documents until about 3 years ago, and I got him some of them, some of the key documents, and a friend of mine found a whole set of them in a library in the back alleys of London and gave them to him, so now he has the whole set. In the 1928 program, there were three basic documents that laid out the program for transforming every square inch of the world into the New World Order. They use the term New World Order. They also call it globalism, and they also call it the end game of communism. And the end game, and they say we're building socialism, we're building communism, we're building democracy, but they never have communism until they have that end game, that New World Order, globalism, the end game of communism, which is a world hierarchy of regional governments with a world without nations, a world without nationalities, a world without boundaries.
Now, in 1992, I had written a book called The Fall of Israel. It was published in England, a very classy operation, Canongate Publishers. It was lead review of The Economist. It was in most of the major British newspapers. My book was about corruption in Israel, and I asked, how did things get so corrupt? But I didn't have any answers. Yeah? I just knew there was deep corruption there. I didn't have an answer why. Now, at the same time, my partner, turned out to be my partner, Joel Boehnerman, had just published a book in New York, Shapolsky Publishers, called Crimes of a President, where he dug into the crimes of the Bush family. Now, while I'm dealing with economic thievery and bribes and blackmail, he is digging in to conspiracy, the real thing. I wasn't doing conspiracy, I was doing corruption. And he discovered the Council on Foreign Relations, and he discovered secret societies and skull and bones and stolen promised software and downed airplanes and all kinds of things I wasn't touching. Joined forces and created a newsletter called Inside Israel. Okay, so I'm still looking at corruption for the first little while. He's looking more at black money, and he's looking more at deep criminality. And then comes the peace process, all right? And that changed everything. Then comes the so-called Oslo peace process. And most of the country thought that way. Come on, you hand 50,000 weapons over to the PLO. What do you think's going to happen? You bring the PLO back in force, put them next to us, and actually arm them? That didn't take tremendous prescience to understand we're going to get a war out of this. That this peace process was a war process. So I started digging. And I get a phone call one day from someone who says, look, I have a contact in, I'm wondering if I should tell you which ministry even. I'm going to tell you which ministry, leave it at that, in the Justice Ministry. This contact also gave the same cables to Steve Rodan of the Jerusalem Post. They did a 3-month search to make sure these were the real things. In the end, they decided they were the real things, and they published a major article. The headline was, Oslo Accord, Israel to return to its 48 borders. And after that, the Foreign Ministry under Shimon Peres and Yossi Beilin had all the newspapers worldwide, all the subscriptions at every embassy, at every consul, canceled. Wow. So you got a pretty good idea that they were right. Now what the Jerusalem Post wouldn't print, we decided we would print. The secret clauses of Oslo were the following, and these were, shall we say, formulated by Yossi Beilin, probably the most evil man in Israel, tied with Peres anyways. The PLO were promised all of Judea and Samaria and Jewish Gaza. The residents of the Jewish residents were going to be removed. A long series of evil, dirty tricks were planned. Now, here is the really difficult part for people to understand. Beilin authorized the murder of Jews to get the residents of Judea and Samaria out of there.
Another book that was very, very significant, and I mentioned it this morning, was Trotsky's book, In Defense of Terrorism, which really is the seminal document on terrorism. You try to find it in this country, it's very difficult. I finally found one on a big computer base at the Army War College Library in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and got the thing on interlibrary law, and it was so flimsy, I Xeroxed the thing and sent it back. But that's the seminal document on terrorism. If you want to understand what's going on in terrorism today and around the world, that is the document to understand, because they're still basically following that. And the basic thesis, if you don't support terrorism, you don't support the cause. And there's no limit to what they would not do to accomplish their objectives.
The plan was, number one, reduce Army presence in these areas. Number two, remove the weapons from the, I'll call them settlers because everyone else does. Remove the weapons from the settlers. Make life day-to-day terror. Next, murder the leaders, the settlement leaders. Demoralize the people. Now we printed this awful scenario, and then a month later, after we printed, less than a month, there were 3 murder attempts in a week, maybe 2. First, Chaim Drucksmann, head of the National Religious Party. Well, his driver is murdered. He survives the shooting of his car. Next, Miriam Lapid, I believe she was number 4 on the Moledet list, right-wing nationalist, patriotic faction. Her husband and her son are murdered. Next, David Axelrod, spokesman for, I believe it was Kach, a right-wing patriotic movement, stabbed, survives, all in a week. The Balin plan was at work. They were going to terrorize the Jews out of their homes. They were going to murder the leaders, as we had written. A plan to, all settlers had to turn in their weapons, supposedly to be checked by the government. Many of them were not returned. The army did reduce its presence on the roads. They were going to get the Jews out of there by murdering them and terrorizing them until they were so demoralized they fled. We were getting the cables directly from the so-called peace process, and what we were reading was terrifying. It was a plan for removal of Jews via terror and murder. After that, what can I tell you? I knew we were playing a very, very powerful and awful game by revealing this.
I had the opportunity to interview a gentleman from Russia. He had been an admiral in the Soviet Navy. His son was flying off of a Soviet carrier. He had been a member, he had been the governor of Kamchatka, which has had a lot of military installations on it. He was, at the time, he was a member of the upper house of the Duma, which is their Senate. And he was over here, and he had had his son going to high school in Fairfax County to finish his last year, and he was using this to hit every single country in the Western Hemisphere, North and South America. He hit 39 of the 50 states in the United States. And I had this opportunity, a one-on-one. We had a translator with us, but and the reason I was there is that people who were hosting his son invited me over to have a chat with this guy. And I remember stepping through who these things were. This, he agreed with that, yes and yes and yes. And then I asked him about who is really orchestrating this thing today. What's their name? I knew they would have changed the name. And I said, it's my understanding from my intelligence sources that it's now called the Gorbachev Foundation. Now, I'm not talking about a Presidio. That's the United States branch of the Gorbachev Foundation. And he said, he laughed and he says, well, I'm not sure. I'll have to get back with you on that question. He said, but I'll tell you this. They are building a brand new 1 kilometer square office complex in Moscow. He said, I don't know where they're getting the money, but they are well financed. I said, well, they're getting the money from the Fortune 500.
One of my leftist friends was very close pals with Ron Pundak. Ron Pundak was one of the 2 negotiators of the Oslo Accord. He arranged a meeting with me and Joel. We met him for 2 hours. Now, you want to hear inside information, I'm going to give you some right from the person who negotiated Oslo. Hirschfeld was Bruno Kreisky's chief aide. Bruno Kreisky was a nasty little Jew from Austria who ran the Socialist International, was real pals with Shimon Peres. He spent his years trying to get Begin out of power. He really despised Begin and the Likud. Hirschfeld was sent to Israel as a plant, and eventually he was one of the 2 Oslo negotiators. Pundak is just a simple-minded creep, an academic who actually believed in utter naivety. Pundak told us the State Department was in on day 1. Day 1. He said, from the first day that we met in Oslo, we were phoning Christopher. And he told us Christopher was very skeptical at first, but became very, very helpful afterwards. Day one, the State Department went on this. Just so you know, that came from the horse's mouth. It was a CFR peace process. It was a Warren Christopher Council on Foreign Relations peace process from day one. Paris, they sent him to France. Paris is all tied up with the French and the Vatican. They sent him to France to negotiate Syria. Okay, they kept him out of the way. Paris did not discover the Oslo negotiations until April, 4 months after they had begun. We find out the secret clauses. We find out that yes, our government is going to reduce Israel to its 1948 borders. That's his plan. That's exactly what's going to happen. We are, in fact, going to see a divided Jerusalem. They're lying to us. We're getting the cables. We're speaking to the insiders. Then Pundak tells us something. Ron Pundak tells me and Joel that Yossi Beilin doesn't believe in borders. He thinks that borders cause war. He said at the end of this process, Israel will not have a border. There will be no more borders. Then we discover Shimon Peres's New Middle East. The New Middle East is Israel without borders. We now become the New Jersey Turnpike. We accept traffic from Iran, going to Morocco, and that's the New Middle East. Israel's borders are going to be destroyed, and Israel will meld itself into a block, into the whole Middle East block, one giant block. That is the Oslo process, as envisioned by Yossi Beilin and Shimon Peres. No more Israel. In fact, no more any countries as such in the Middle East. We now become the EU. And eventually the EU and the Middle East bloc and the NAFTA bloc will become one giant happy world family run by the people ordering us into the Oslo process. And I'm getting this from the top of the heap. Okay? This is real. These people are actually doing this. They are planning to destroy Israel's borders.
When Rulers of Evil came out and I started getting on radio shows, I asked each talk show host if he was brought up in a particular religious faith. That was just one of my standard questions, and they all answered me quite frankly. With the exception of 2 out of about 26, everyone had been brought up in the Roman Catholic Church. The 2 who were not Roman Catholics were Jews. Now, I establish in Rules of Evil, Inter Mirifica, I present, it was a papal encyclical that was written by Pope Paul VI in about 1964, in which he said, the Catholic Church owns all of the communications media, and therefore members of the Catholic Church should seek the leadership in all of these media and should do so with a view toward evangelizing the world to Roman Catholicism. And so I rest my case with that count with the little canvas that I did with the talk show hosts all over the country. Now there was another interesting phenomenon. Not one of those talk show hosts attacked me. Not one of them said, I think your book is crazy. They all saw that it was, because the ones who had read the book saw that the book is based on evidence that's simply there, and it's very difficult to refute the evidence. If you don't like the book, go to the evidence, don't go to me. Alan Colmes has a radio show in New York. You know probably Hannity and Colmes. Well, this is not the TV show, it's a radio show. Alan Colmes is Jewish, Hannity is Catholic. And it's my theory that Judaism, that the active participants of Judaism, such as it is, are, as a matter of fact, operatives of Roman Catholicism, operatives of the papacy. And our scriptural support for that is when the Sanhedrin told Pontius Pilate, we have no king but Caesar. And the papacy is nothing more than Caesar in modern terms, because Caesar was the head of the Roman Church as well as of its state. Caesar's title was Pontifex Maximus, which is exactly the title of the Pope of the Catholic Church. It's the use of this kind of information that you got to be very perceptive of. That, you know, some of the most ruthlessly anti-Jesuit material, I believe, has been commissioned by the Society of Jesus. That's one of the great lessons of my read on the American Revolution, because even as the colonists were being turned against Great Britain, Europe was being turned against the Jesuits. Voltaire was writing his anti-Jesuit plays, and kings were kicking the Jesuits out of their countries, and the Jesuits, between 1758 and 1773, the Jesuits went from the most powerful political body in the world. The Secretary of State in Vienna said that the Jesuits rule Vienna with an iron hand, and if anybody disagrees with them, they get thrown out. So the Jesuits were a law unto themselves, a state unto themselves, all over Europe, all over the world. They go from that to oblivion in 1773, when Pope Clement XIV abolishes the Society of Jesus for all eternity, and that's the bull, all eternity, so that there should never be any more Jesuits. Well, the Jesuits were then in a position to say to the Protestant functionaries in the American Revolution, hey, we've been kicked out of our church no longer likes us. The church is a thing of the past, it's going down the tubes, we want to help you guys establish a good society.
Mark Halter, a close friend of Shimon Peres, a French intellectual, well-known writer, is interviewed in Hadashot, and he says he delivered a message to the Holy See in May 1993, in which Peres offered the Vatican control over the old city of Jerusalem by the millennium. Now here are the terms. The United Nations guards this entity. UN comes in and gets protectorate status. They give the PLO state a capital within their protectorate. The Vatican takes over the holy sites. The airport at Atarot in Jerusalem becomes an international free trade zone in diplomacy. No one needs a passport. You can come negotiate, do whatever you want. Free trade zone in diplomacy. This wacky plan is what Mark Halter delivered to the Pope. Now, incidentally, Halter himself backed up every word he said. So if you have any problems with this wacky plan, number one, go to Mark Halter. Lives in Paris. Now, after that, we discovered that the Italian magazine, newspaper, La Stampa, also reported this deal. But they added things. They added that Yasser Arafat accepted this, because that way he'd get a capital. Vatican or not, he gets a capital. And they were part of those secret clauses of Oslo. In this case, it was the secret clause of the Declaration of Principles, signed in September 1993. Arafat accepted it. And when later on in the year 2001, 2000 actually, when it was clear that he was not going to get a state, the Vatican weren't coming, that Barack and the Clinton administration were not so crazy about this deal, he just exploded the whole region. But that was the original deal. People say it's fantastic, Paris would never do such a thing. They didn't realize then what a monster he was. Okay? You thought he was a patriotic Jew back then. It took me a few years to realize that he is nothing of the sort. He has no allegiances to Judaism, in fact hates Judaism. Back then it seemed fantastic.
And in this Capitol Rotunda, they've got a picture of Mercury, who was the god of, Roman god of commerce and of thieves, and he's handing a bag of gold to Robert Morris, who was a financier of the American Revolution. Now, is this not a metaphor for the fact that Rome funded the revolution? And is not the fact that virtually every federal agency. Virtually every Senate and House subcommittee governing every aspect of life in federal America is headed by a Roman Catholic. Isn't that some evidence that there was some Catholic involvement in the founding of the country? Now, it's so funny that when I talk like this around crowds who haven't read Rulers of Evil, you know, they say, well, what are you want to amend the Constitution? You want to throw all the Catholics out? And my attitude is no. It's just, that's the way it's supposed to be. It gives more meaning to Ben Franklin's statement, Madam, we have founded a republic if you can keep it, than just about any information I can think of, because it would be a Christian republic as long as the Christians would homeschool, as long as they would look to Jesus Christ for their government and not to Washington, D.C. for their government. That's what the republic was all about. The republic was, let's let Jesus Christ rule us. And the federal system can't rule a person under Jesus Christ unless that person applies to it for government.
From 1955 to 1988, the Sino-Soviet conflict was the key disinformation program, according to Glitzen. And the recent book he wrote, Perestroika Deception, he said the Sino-Soviet conflict was the key disinformation program on which all other disinformation programs depended. From 1992 until today, the biggest propaganda disinformation program that they've been conducting around the world is communism is dead. And guys, people who are opposed to communism, communism is dead, and the people who are opposed to the transforming processes now are the generators of hate. You will see that over and over and over.
Hello.
Hello, Jim.
Hello. Does that sound any better?
Sounds great to me. You have the Jesuits running things, or you have another group running things.
Yeah.
And your testimony as being someone working in the trenches.
Yeah.
Who slaps down? What judges rule against you? You know, I mean,
to all the people who have contacted me and said this is primarily a Jesuit Vatican conspiracy, I have said, well, give me your strongest fact. My strongest fact that it is primarily a Jewish Freemason and primarily Jewish run operation is that Jews own all 5 TV networks, all the major 5 TV networks except for Fox, and Murdoch, who's head of Fox, always says, I am a Zionist, and has pro-Zionist meetings all the time. So that TV is in everyone's living room, and they own Clear Channel, which is 1,200 of the radio, and I think they own the other 2 or 3 major radio networks. That is a pretty strong fact. The Jewish power in the media, which is in the essay Who Rules America, which you can find on the internet going to Google and punching in Who Rules America, they document, right now they're up to December 2002, that the Jews run the media. Now, what is the strongest fact that somebody has? That the Jesuits are behind all of this, and I never get back anything. I've never gotten back anything I can sink my teeth into. I've been fighting the vote fraud battle for over 2 decades, and while I hear Barry Chamish or Tupper Saucy say it's the Jesuits, when we actually try to get something on the media or to get something done in the local Republican Party or at a city council or the state legislature, we find that we're running into secular Jews and Freemasons, and usually Jews who are Freemasons, and that's who stops us, not Jesuits. You know, if anyone reviews the interrogation of Christian Rakovsky by Stalin's secret police in 1938, which is in the book Red Symphony, then the phenomenal disclosure is he describes a Freemasonic Jewish hierarchy, primarily Jews, but also Freemasons, as pulling all the strings in the world behind Stalin, behind Hitler, and sometimes being upset with them. But the hierarchy describes as, he didn't even mention the Vatican or the Jesuits. He mentioned the secular Jews and the Freemasons, who are such as the Rothschilds, who are at the top of world banking and the world revolution. Interestingly enough, when the communists took over Russia in 1917, 80% of the ruling Politburo, or whatever they called it at that time, was Jewish, and I've seen credible documentation from a number of sources that fully one half of that 80% were from New York City and didn't even speak Russian when they got there. So maybe we're going through a reverse thing now. L.T. Patterson of Criminal Politics addressed that 5 or 10 years ago and said, this is a move. They're moving, in his mind, and I think he may be right, they're moving Khazar Russian Jews as opposed to the Hebrews Jews that are a minority really of Jews today in the world. The Khazar Jews are a Mongolian Turkish tribe that converted to Judaism in the 11th century, used to have their own country called Khazaria, if you can find an old enough map in the Encyclopedia Britannica, or one that deals with the Middle Ages. They are moving to Israel and then to this country, or maybe straight to this country. He believes it is to manage the population here in the New World Order tyranny. So that is, I don't know that they need any more help here, but it may be that they're wanting to bring in some more. Chamish is right in that the powers that be don't care if they sacrifice 1/3 of Israel, and he smells that they're getting set up for their own bloodbath. I believe that that's true. But I was disappointed in his tape that he pretended like the Palestinians just have a animus against Israel without getting into the takeover of all of their land and homes that happened in 48. So that I thought was lacking in his tape. The powers of evil have coalesced. Their greatest victory, still unbeknownst to almost everyone, is the takeover of the Vatican. And that's based on the research primarily of Gary Giuffre of Texas, who published about 80 pages on this 13 years ago. But there's a lot more research that has not been published. So, yes, there is truth to that. But who you run into when you are actually fighting the battle, who owns all the television stations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, who owns Clear Channel Radio, which now has 1,200 channels, I consistently run into about half secular Freemasonic type Jews and half Christians who have become Freemasons. And I think if you follow that up the line, that ultimately that hierarchy, which will kill those who get out of line, even though they have infighting, they'll kill those who get out of line, that is where the power is. Have there been some bad Jesuits in history? Absolutely. Is the top of the Jesuit order now probably working with the New World Order hierarchy? Yes. But the idea that that is the main force moving the New World Order establishment, I think, is just cannot be supported when you begin to look at the facts and who's manning the positions that you can see everywhere.
When I came out with my first newspaper 10 years ago, I was immediately libeled, slandered, listed as armed and dangerous. Well, you know, that was coming from the ADL. I didn't even know who the ADL was. And why were they attacking me? Armed and dangerous. I called them up. I said, well, you know what? You might have got something right. Because I am armed, and if you come into my home, mess with my family, I'm definitely dangerous. I've been publishing a biker magazine and other types of magazines for probably 20 years. Another 10 years past the Free American. I had naked women in it. I had curse words in it. And nobody seemed to care. Matter of fact, I had double the circulation of a biker magazine than I did the Free American. Go figure. But as soon as I started talking about something that really mattered, as opposed to where the next party was or where the runs were going to be and what the cops had done to the bikers and that kind of thing, I started running into flack. Again, I didn't even know who the ADL was. Didn't know they were part of B'nai B'rith. All I knew is suddenly I'm listed up there with politicians like Charles Duke of Colorado, like presidential candidate Charles Collins. I was right in between Charlie Duke and Charles Collins. There's Clay Douglas, armed and dangerous, a false patriot, according to Morris Dees, who never met me. And you know, now I'm kind of going through an identity crisis. For 8 years of the Clinton administration, I was, well, to the right of Rush Limbaugh, let's say. I was labeled a right-wing extremist. It appeared in the FBI bulletin that followed up the armed and dangerous, same wording, same people. But now the FBI is putting out this thing that says Clay Douglas is a right-wing extremist. So I was against Clinton. I was against his brand of politics. I was against him selling us out to China, selling our technology to China. And I even actually put a favorable photograph of George Bush when he got elected. Got me chewed out by a few people. Suddenly, we triumphed. We got Bill Clinton out of office. Well, he was going out anyway, but we kept Al Gore from getting in office. I thought that was a pretty major accomplishment. I was happy with myself for about 5 or 10 minutes. And then I started getting attacked from the right. Suddenly, I'm no longer a right-wing extremist. Now I'm a communist. According to David Horowitz, this may get confusing, so try to follow me. David Horowitz is a Republican commentator who used to be a communist and happens to be Jewish. For a right-wing extremist, you know, I mean, it's really upsetting to suddenly be agreeing with Bill Press. So what's wrong with that picture? We're supposed to have won. You know, as a conservative, standing up for American values, standing up for Christian values, bringing people like Pat Buchanan on my show, suddenly I'm being attacked from the right. It appears that whoever is in power doesn't like Clay Douglas. I'm hurt.
Folks, don't languish in denial. Knowledge is your best defense. At the Free American, we don't apologize if we've pushed your paradigms. You'll find true peace of mind at the Free American Expos, where you can gain more information in the company of like-minded people. Join our ongoing dialogue at the Free American Radio Hour on shortwave or the internet. Be there or be square. And be sure to join us on take 2 of this series.